So Benavidez versus Morrell is right around the corner, and I gotta say this is probably the best way to start the year. So as a boxing fan, we've been clamoring for these 50-50 matchups, and this is about as 50-50 of a matchup as you can get. So taking a look at some of the statistics here, so David Benavidez and David Morrell are both pretty big fighters, but it's clear that the experience factor lies with Benavidez. So as of late, Benavidez has been facing the tougher opposition. I think that's clear. When it comes to fighters like Plant, Andrade, Vosdick, it's clear that Benavidez is, at a slightly further point in his career than David Morrell. But that's not really a knock on David Morrell. People seem to forget that David Morrell has been able to curate and develop his professional style in just 11 fights. Like, the guy started fighting, I think, in 2019 or something like that. So he only has 5 to 6 years of fighting. But if you look at his record, for the most part, all the people that he's facing have winning records. There's very minor losses when compared to wins when it comes to his record. Honestly, it's similar, with the exception of Plant, Andrade, and Vosdick. The competition that Morrell was facing up until this point was very similar to what Benavidez was facing. But I think these last 3 fights are really going to give Benavidez the edge because he received the pay-per-view experience, right? Being the main attraction for 2 of those cards in Andrade and Plant, I think it does help a fighter, right? When it comes to those intangible experiences. And when it comes to, press conferences and staying cool and calm, collected, I think Benavidez in that aspect is doing a lot better than Morrell is. I also think that this animosity that they're developing, I think more than anything, it's probably to sell some extra pay-per-views. I don't think that the fighters actually feel too much ill will towards each other. I think more than anything, they're just trying to get themselves psyched up to, cause damage to one another, which is okay. Like, it's entertaining to watch some of this press conference stuff and some of the behind-the-scenes meetings between the 2 fighters. And I guess if it has zero role in the promotion and in the fight overall, then, we probably wouldn't have it. But I'm sure that there's some mental games going on here for both fighters. So based on the gloves off episodes that I've been seeing, both fighters look to be in tremendous shape. I would say more than anything, Morrell looks like he's just about ready to fight, and Benavidez looks like he still needs to shed some pounds. But I think it's clear that we've gotten the most dedicated Benavidez in the last few years, and he's shown that his stamina and his gas tank is probably his best attribute. So people like to say that David Benavidez is a power puncher. I don't tend to agree with that sentiment. I think he's an overwhelming, throws a lot of combinations and overwhelms his opponents. Not similar to Earl Spence because he's not as technically sound, but I think that in that same vein, it's more about consistently breaking and wearing you down. When it comes to David Morrell, we've seen him take on a few different styles. With the exception of maybe 2 fighters on his resume, he hasn't gone the distance with most of his opponents. And he's able to switch up and dominate his opposition based on what he needs to do in order to win the fight. So David Morrell doesn't take into the typical Cuban amateur style where he's sticking and moving and doing all kinds of movement in the way that Lara or Rigondeaux would. But I think he's probably able to do it, but his fight nature won't allow him to do that. And I think that that'll also be one of the issues that causes him problems. So in the fights with Caleb Plant, I think Benavidez showed that he does have issues when it comes to facing pure boxers. Caleb Plant was giving him all kinds of fits when it came to the first 5 or 6 rounds of that fight. If anything, I think Caleb Plant had it a clean sweep up until that point. And a lot of people remember the back half of that fight where Benavidez began to dominate and take over. But if you score the fight the way it should be scored, which is round by round, that fight was a lot more competitive than people remember it being. And I think that David Morrell might not fight in a similar style, but I think he has the attributes to put on a performance in the way that Caleb Plant had, with one particular note in addition. So the one thing that all of the fighters that David Benavidez has been fighting have in common is that they lack power. So I would say David Morrell is probably going to be, with the exception of Angulo, because I've heard that he's a strong power puncher, I think David Morrell is probably going to be the most technically sound, hardest-hitting fighter that David Benavidez has faced up until this point. I would even rate this challenge higher than the Vosdick fight, because in the Vosdick fight, he had been out of the ring for 3 years. He had a couple tune-up fights, but it wasn't against the competition that would prep him for a David Benavidez. And so the style matchup is extremely interesting because we kind of have an idea of how David Benavidez is going to come into this fight, but we're not really sure how David Morrell is going to play into it. One of the issues that David Morrell has with his competition, though, is that up until this point, he's faced nothing but smaller fighters than him. And I guess you could say the same thing about Benavidez, but he at least fought a career lightweight and a career super middleweight in Caleb Plant and Vosdick. When it comes to David Morrell, I would say his fight with Hot Rod was he struggled a lot more in his fight with Hot Rod versus the way that Benavidez struggled in his fight with Vosdick. And, fighters tend to make excuses after the fight, but I think if you watch the performance and you're honest with yourself, it was clear that Benavidez, especially looking at the post-fight press conference, it was clear that Benavidez was having issues with his hands and was dealing with a previous cut from sparring and things like that. So I don't think that was a 100% Benavidez, but from what I've heard from fighters, no fighter is really ever 100% when they enter a fight. But regardless, so when it comes to the style matchup, we know how David Benavidez is going to approach this fight, but we're not really sure how Morrell is. And I think that that's the play here. We know that David Benavidez is, for the most part, going to come with pressure, but we're not really sure how Morrell is going to approach this. Up until this point, Morrell hasn't shown to be chinny, and neither has Benavidez, but we have seen him dropped. The only fight that Benavidez did get dropped in, though, if I remember correctly, he came and avenged that in a rematch. So, I'd like to think that David Benavidez has gotten better since then. The stats that a lot of people don't talk about is David Benavidez's defense. So there's that saying that old-timers like Teddy Atlas used to say, where your offense becomes your defense. And I think that's the case with David Benavidez. So, sometimes he, squares up and becomes very square, but as soon as he sees an opening, he starts throwing punches. And as he's throwing these punches, so far, a fighter hasn't necessarily been able to time him too well, but you can see how there's openings if a fighter's willing and able to engage. But the problem with that is that that in that time span that you're trying to land a single punch, David Benavidez has thrown 5, 6, 7 punches. And so it looks good for the judges scoring the fight. It looks good for the audience. And it also becomes intimidating for the fighter that's, fighting Benavidez to want to throw something back because he knows there's so many shots coming in. But I don't think David Morrell is going to be afraid of that because he's probably going to be the biggest fighter that Benavidez has faced until this point. Again, Morrell hasn't shown to be chinny. Morrell has shown that he's able to keep up, stamina-wise with every single fight, with the exception being the Hot Rod fight. And so I think that this fight is going to be a fight of experience and will. I think early on we're going to see Benavidez have trouble with the pressure and the boxing ability of Morrell, but eventually as the pressure starts to wear on, I could see Benavidez causing Morrell to kind of shell up and fight a lot more on the back foot. And it's a very interesting class of styles, and it's one of those fights where you can see ways that both fighters can win. But if I had to make a pick myself, I would say that I'd give Benavidez a 60 to maybe 55 edge when it comes to his possibilities of winning. I think that if this fight were to happen in a couple more years, I would definitely give Morrell the edge. But the fact that Benavidez has shown that he's able to keep up with top-level opposition lately, I have to give him the edge. But I also appreciate the fact that David Benavidez is sticking true to his word. He's a throwback fighter who's willing to fight anyone and everyone around his weight class. And regardless of whether Benavidez wins or Morrell wins, there's a lot of interesting matchups that could happen in the light heavyweight division. I think Benavidez versus either Beterbiev or Bivol will be extremely interesting. Morrell versus either one of those fighters will also be interesting. And so there's so many different matchups that can happen here. But, the future looks bright for both David Benavidez and Morrell, and honestly, I don't think that there's going to be a loser here. The only issue that I might have with this fight is people not giving Benavidez enough credit for the Morrell win because, he lacks a little bit of experience, but I think Benavidez is catching him at a good time. He's not quite yet fully developed, but I think Morrell has shown enough talent and ability to say that he's probably going to be the toughest opponent that Benavidez has faced thus far. If I had to make an official pick for this fight, I actually don't think that Benavidez is going to get the knockout. I think that this is going to be a split decision or a unanimous decision for Benavidez. I could see the pressure mounting across rounds, not necessarily getting a stoppage. If a stoppage did come, it could come from both sides. Morrell does have enough power to hurt Benavidez, but I think that what he lacks in experience is probably going to be the defining thing here. In the comments, let me know who you guys have winning this fight. Is this a fight that you guys, are looking forward to? Personally, I'm really looking forward to this fight. I don't agree with it being pay-per-view, though. I think that PBC should have made this a free fight for many people to watch. They probably would get a lot more viewership that way. But I could see why, you know, with the lack of scheduling on Amazon and things like that, I could see why they're going to want to put this fight on pay-per-view. But also, on a side note, an issue with putting this on pay-per-view, and if it performs poorly, as you know, we heard that the Andrade fight and the Plant fight performed poorly with Benavidez. I think it doesn't give Benavidez the leverage that he would want in a Canelo fight. Not that Canelo would, you know, fight him at this point, but, you know, that's been one of the arguments against Benavidez, is that he's not a ticket seller and he doesn't sell pay-per-views. And so I think that by making this a pay-per-view fight, you're kind of taking away from some of the eyeballs that would be watching it, you know, if it weren't. So I think for now, you know, Benavidez is a champion. He's shown that he's willing and able to fight anybody. But my suggestion to PBC would be to let him grow, let his profile build, and to not, you know, put this on pay-per-view. Because, you know, as we've seen with Riyadh season, the pay-per-view fights that they're putting on are $20, $25, maybe $45 on the high end. And for people to be shooting $80 every other month now, it just doesn't make sense. But regardless, it's a stacked card. It's a great matchup, and I can't wait to see what you guys have to say. Peace.